Welcome everyone to episode 15 of Developer Dialogue. I'm Jean, the strategy wargamer, and today this is a really special episode for me, guys. I have the privilege and honor of having two developers from my all-time favorite game, a game that, suffice to say, changed my life, and I've been playing it for 22 years, and that's Star Trek Birth of the Federation. And I have on Wella, Lasola, producer and project manager of the game, and Bill Chin, engineering lead and design lead for Star Trek Birth of the Federation. Welcome on, guys. Thank you so much for coming on. I can't tell you how much this means to us, to me, and the Star Trek gaming community, too.
Sure. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah.
So I gotta just first dive in on it, because I'm assuming one of the first questions everybody's gonna ask is, first, are you guys both Star Trek fans?
Yeah, I'm a big Star Trek fan. I was a Star Trek fan I grew up with Star Trek, so I actually like Star Trek quite a bit, and actually I still have lots of Star Trek paraphernalia, and I still watch Discovery and
oh, nice,
Lower Decks like that. So yes, I am a Star Trek fan.
I liked Star Trek, the original series.
Oh, nice.
Of course, Captain Kirk. Who doesn't love Captain Kirk and Spock? And it's kind of funny because it was only when we were making this game that I did start diving into Star Trek: The Next Generation, and that's how I watched a lot of it. And of course, you can't help but admire Captain Picard, these are some of the great characters in science fiction.
I'm kind of curious. What do you guys think about? So I think when you guys were making the game, it was considered the first golden age of Star Trek, right? Because you had, I think at that time, was there 3 Star Trek series that were going on at one time, I believe?
Well, Deep Space Nine was really going on at that time. So I remember watching Deep Space Nine while we were working on the project late at night. So, I remember that distinctly, yeah. So I think Voyager had been sort of kicking off at some point in there. I don't know if it was at the same time, but I remember watching Deep Space Nine. And actually, Deep Space Nine has obviously has a lot of links to, Birth of the Federation, if you will. It's got the same kind of political, territorial, large-scale space opera that actually meshes with the game, right?
That's true, yeah. There's a lot of political, definitely on the diplomacy side.
Yeah, well, you have the Klingons, you have the Cardassians, and, you have all of that. And, but we didn't have a Deep Space Nine license, so no Dominion, so there you are. It would have been the logical thing to stick in the game, but, again, no license for it, so...
Yeah, we were talking about that in the pre-show, so I'm kind of curious. So I guess we can start where did the initial idea for the game come from, and how was the license adopted, and how did that all get to start?
Well, okay, so Microprose / Spectrum Holobyte bought Microprose. They had Star Trek license. They had done previous games, and they had sort of a Star Trek Next Generation license to make games. They did a Final Unity, which I think Wella worked on, and so it was Generations, and those were Star Trek Generations, which is another game that Microprose had done before. So they actually had a number of Star Trek games that they could make. And the thing about it is, if you really think about it, Microprose is also known for Civilization and Master of Orion and Colonization and a lot of strategy games, right? So it's a natural thing to just move Star Trek into that genre. And if you really think about it also, it makes sense for Star Trek because you're dealing with, especially like I said, at that time, you're dealing with the entire Federation and the Klingons and the Cardassians. You have natural enemies to make a Star Trek game out of, right? So that's pretty much where it came from. You have a license, and the company itself has a long heritage of making strategy games. And particularly if you look at Civilization as an example of a game that was very profitable for Microprose and a game that's well acclaimed too. So
I remember there was that feeling in the hallways that Civilization and Star Trek were kind of like you could sort of mash them together. I think that's one way maybe that you can look at Birth of the Federation.
Yeah.
I also wanted to point out that that when Bill and I were working at this company, it was actually Spectrum Holobyte.
Oh.
And then in 1993, Spectrum Holobyte purchased Microprose, and then we switched to using the Microprose name. So Spectrum Holobyte has more of a history with flight simulations. That's really, and like the big way the way that they made their name was with flight simulations and Tetris on for computer for DOS, right? Sorry, this is so long ago. But then it was when Spectrum Holobyte bought Microprose, then you're now bringing in Spectrum Holobyte Star Trek: The Next Generation license with Microprose, which has that long history of making strategy games. So the idea of having a turn-based strategy game with a Star Trek license became Birth of the Federation.
Yeah, and also Microprose published and developed with Simtex, which was part of Microprose, Master of Orion. And you can see a lot of Master of Orion heritage inside of Star Trek, Birth of the Federation, right?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely got that feel. But I'm kind of curious. So, like, when you guys were starting the game, you guys had Star Trek: The Next Generation license. How difficult was it to get the Deep Space Nine and Voyager and the original series? What kind of challenges did that present?
Well, we didn't have those. Basically, you know, the licenses sliced up based on who basically bought it, right? So, or is renting it, if you will. So basically, that's why there are no, as I said before, there's no Constitution class ships in the game, and you know, as far as like the Dominion doesn't make an appearance because we don't have a Deep Space Nine license. We have Star Trek: The Birth of the Next Generation. So anything that was in Star Trek: The Next Generation is pretty much fair game to stick in, and that's what we did. So, and that includes the races too. So, and it's like I said, it's very much like any other licensed product, whether it be, you know, Marvel product or whatnot, where it's sliced up based on, you know, what the license holder has paid for. So that's why, you know, you would have to get some cooperation with someone else owning the license to be able to put it in, much in the way that you see like Marvel and Sony working together to put Spider-Man in, you know, the MCU. You'd have to agree to it. You'd have to probably exchange money or something.
I'm kind of curious. One of the fan questions were, how is the relationship between your studio and I think you were mentioning Viacom owned the rights to?
Well, I mean, they're the license holder, right? So that's basically, it's the same kind of relationship you'd have. They have final approval of what you stick in the game. So you really have to look at it as you're licensing it from them, and they have final approval because it's their property. So it just has to, you know, uphold their license in a way that looks good, right? That's like, it's pretty much like anything. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the NFL or NASCAR or Marvel. The license holder almost always has final approval.
Yeah, so Viacom controlled the Star Trek: The Next Generation intellectual property. So basically, like everything that we designed, like artistic, like if you're talking about like creative that has the license, like they had to approve to make sure that yes, you are portraying Captain Picard correctly. You know, you're not going. You're not diluting the license. You're not tainting the license in some way. That the UI that you design is in the same aesthetic, you know, as the Star Trek Next Generation intellectual property. So that's like a big part of it.
How did the project initially get started, and how did the team kind of get together?
Well, that was it originally came down as something that actually the upper management wanted to do. Actually, it wasn't like it came as a hey, we have these two things, and I believe Jeff and I went to the actual greenlight meeting, and then it got approved to go work on it, and that was it. I mean, really, I think the idea of it really came about because it's a natural thing because of the fact that the company had the Star Trek license and was in strategy games, and it seemed like a good thing to build.
And so I'm kind of curious, when did you guys start like developing Star Trek Birth of the Federation, and like how long did it take from initial, like the moment you guys started the design process all the way to release?
Well, I don't know. It's more
Wasn't
than
it
2 years.
1998? Was it
Yeah,
1998 or 1997? Because it
I think
came
it's
out
97,
in 99, right? And I
99.
remember we definitely worked more than 1 year on it. I almost want to say a year and a half.
It's somewhere between a year and a half and 2 years, I think, somewhere around there. I actually think it's closer to two than it is to a year and a half, but it felt like that at least.
I feel like
Yeah, maybe you're right because I think I was working on another project. I was working on Falcon.
Yeah, because as I recall, we finished Top Gun, and then
Mhm.
after that, this started, and there was some number of months of sort of trying to go over what this would be to make a technical design, and then it had to go to the company to approve, and then they said go for it, and then after that, it was still. This is rare because this is one of the few games that I can say I wrote the first line of code for this game. Often these days, most people don't do that. So
so. You guys started from scratch with the code.
this is from scratch. Well, it's largely from scratch. The only things that are not from scratch are the graphics engine, which is actually Falcon's graphics engine.
Oh wow!
And yeah, this is the same graphics engine that Falcon 4 has, which I think people have already figured out.
So the way I look at the game is it's basically like two separate games in one, right? Because you had like a strategic side, which was like the 4X side, and a tactical side. I'm kind of curious because like that's a huge undertaking in my book, I think, because I'm kind of curious, like what kind of challenges does that present to you guys mixing two games into one?
Well, it's not really two games into one. It's really what it is it just kind of looks like that. So the big thing about it was we wanted 3D space combat, and the thing about it was Falcon's graphics engine was good for that. Matter of fact, it's more amenable because there's no terrain. You're out in space, so it's and actually the way that graphics engine worked was actually very amenable to this because. Once you take one of the biggest things that is costly at that time for graphics engines. Well, one, this was before 3D acceleration of hardware. You didn't have graphics cards that were accelerated.
Oh,
Two, so you had to support software rendering as well as hardware, and we used a technique called BSP, which is basically more suited for flight simulators, but also works for things in space. So the big thing about it was that we looked at that and said that was a good graphics engine because, at the time you could have hundreds of ships fighting hundreds of ships, which at the time was really unheard of, right? Mm-hmm. You don't really think of that in flight simulator. We did do that, and but actually it was a lot of work, and Sammy did a lot of the work on the space combat. But that was a choice early on because we kind of thought that we wanted to get the epicness of space combat because at that time Master of Orion and a lot of the space combat games were just pixel basically 2D tile type games where you basically just move your ship and do whatever, and this was trying to get across the large scale of fleet combat. It was kind of a combination of what it turned out to be. We ended up simplifying the combat to being what it is where you give out those orders, but there was a time when it was intended to be more complex than what it turned up being. But I think the issue with that was if we kept on going down that path, it would have taken forever to play the game.
That's interesting. I didn't know I didn't know that was the. So I'm kind of jumping off that question. What were the initial designs of the game that you originally had and that you changed over, I guess, the course of development?
The design of the game was actually bigger. It was actually. There was supposed to be ship design, which is actually in Master of Orion, and we ended up dropping that. And I think it was good that we did because that's a whole, other problem that gets actually even more complex. I think it felt more like Star Trek to not have ship design. That was actually a suggestion from Steve Garcia, who was the designer of Master of Orion. He actually said, It was an interesting because we did talk to Steve Garcia, the designer of Master of Orion, when we developed this game. He gave us a lot of good input. So much so, I believe he even has a thank you at the end of the credits. And so he gave us a lot of good feedback about the game. But basically, it was one of scope and how much we actually reduced the scope of the game. It was actually a much bigger game in many ways than what shipped, and I think it was too much actually to make in the time allotted. The original design of the game was way bigger.
When you said it was supposed to be bigger, like, can you give a couple of examples on any the ideas that you guys had?
Well, it was a much more complex model for worker placement on systems than you had now. You have the sliders, which just allocate how many people you have. But originally, the design was closer to Civilization, which had typical worker placement, and that was going to be more tedious from my point of view. As it is, the UI is actually, there's a lot of UI in the game already. There was a discussion about having heroes in the game. That would have been a substantial change, and that would have been a licensing nightmare too. But we didn't go down that path. But that was a very common idea. That was actually something that we liked. Another game that a board game that influenced the design of Star Trek was it was Dune. Have you ever played the Dune board game? The Dune board game has some interesting things in it, which are basically, it had heroes and some amount of treachery, and it had a lot of things with asymmetric sides, right? So there was some influence. So that was a bit of a design influence on the game, for sure. But again, it's like way more stuff to put in the game than we could do.
This question is for since you guys were on different working on different aspects of the game. I'm kind of curious, for each of you, what was the most challenging aspect of developing the game? I know, Bill, you were working on engineering and design, and Wella, you were working on producing and managing the game. I'm just kind of curious, what kind of comes up when you think about the game in terms of the most challenging part of it, developing it?
I'll let Wella answer first.
What I remember the most was we had a lot of long nights, and we worked weekends.
Oh, wow.
Like there was just a lot to get done with this game. And so it was, especially when we were getting much closer and there was a lot of QA involvement. We had a lot of late nights where the team would actually eat together. Like we would order dinner. I'd order dinner. We'd have dinner brought in. We'd all gather in the conference room, take a dinner break, and then we would then afterwards we'd go back to work and work till like 1 or 2 in the morning sometimes.
Wow.
So there was, there was a lot of hours put into that game.
Yeah. So I would agree with that. That's actually one of the most challenging. It was a lot to get done, and I think it was really the fact that we had the design challenge of the game was just so big. And I remember constantly trying to reduce the scope of what we were doing so we could get it finished. And there were a lot of long nights. I would agree with that. And I actually would say I learned a lot about team development and game development on that project. And that the long nights was definitely something I learned a lot about. And I would say I've endeavored not to do that again.
It was also, I mean, even though Bill was saying, like, compared to today's standards, it was not a big team. Even at the time, like, that was still a pretty big team. There were a lot of artists. Yeah. And maybe in terms of engineering, it was like less than 10 people. But that's still, like, a lot of, still a lot to manage. Like, I recall that, like Bill and I had worked together before on another game, and he wanted me to be the project manager on this game because basically he was like, Wella, I just want you to take a bunch of stuff off my plate. Bill was like, I don't want to deal with management. I don't want to deal with marketing. Like I don't want to deal with like schedules, because Bill had a lot. He was designing and he was also the lead engineer. And I totally got that. And we had worked very well together before. So I was like, yeah, like I got you. Like I can do this. I'll take all of these things away. Like I'll be that buffer so you don't have to deal as much with the rest of the company. And then I could deal with, like there's there's like a bunch of things. I even have like a list here that I was able to dig up from my files about what I was supposed to do as the project manager. And there's stuff here like keeper of the schedules, creating, tracking, submitting it to studio management. Like I had to work with the lead artist, the lead engineer, the lead designer, like the sound department, all of that. And then like conflict resolution, like being the arbiter, being the mediator, within the team, and just like all kinds of logistics and all the interdepartmental communications. So it was like all of these different things that the way I saw it was, if I can get this off of Bill's, plate, if Bill doesn't have to deal with it, then he can just go and concentrate on making the game.
That's a monumental task. I mean, working with all those departments, I guess a question I have is like, I know, Bill, you were mentioning earlier that I think you said you had six or seven engineers. How big was the whole team, completely?
Well, Will is correct that actually the Star Trek team was actually no bigger than, like, say, Top Gun, I think. Top Gun had about the same size at that time. So at the time, the team was probably comparable to teams of other projects. Because now I think about it, total engineering team on Top Gun was probably about the same, around 6 or so. The number of artists is like, you remember the number of artists, Wella? It's more, they outnumber engineering for sure.
Yeah. I want to say it was like at least a dozen people. I want to say. It's pretty much anytime there's an artist free, then it's like you just give them work.
and we started gobbling up artists toward the end of the project. We got more as different other projects finished. We actually accumulated more people on art, because actually Star Trek is a very art heavy game actually. So yeah, there was a lot of art to deal with, both on between the little monuments and all the ships to make and all the technical aspects of that. So there was. I would guess it was probably 12 to 20 artists. So there, design wise, and then there was a lot of work put in by QA too. We had a lot. This is the type of game that also requires a lot of QA because it's an emergent game where it's emergent gameplay. It's not scripted, and so and QA did provide a lot of good design feedback in terms of how well they played. The QA got to be experts in playing the different races, and it was very interesting to hear some of the feedback that we got from QA that we incorporated in the game. So all the way from, the Cardassians who were really good at intelligence, the Ferengi leveraging making money and as a strategy to win the game. Those things actually were very valuable for how the game was tuned from QA, actually. Especially since you have to play the game for a long time to get some of that to fruition, right?
You were mentioning that in regards to QA, one of the I guess the when the game initially released, I believe there was like a bug that was in the game. I think it was like a memory leak bug. I guess it was you only pick it up when you're. I only noticed it when you get up to like turn 300 or 400, 500, which I was one of those people that made like a whole year of every game. So I would get to 500, 600, and I would notice the memory leak bug. But I love the game so much, so I just clicked end turn, went made dinner, eat it, and then come back. And I still do that.
It should be the case that you should have been able to clear the memory leak by simply just exiting the game, save, exit, come back, and then reload it again.
Really? Well, I wish I knew that 20 years ago.
Yeah. It should be the case because basically the leak that's just basically is leaking into the operating system. So either a reboot or a restart of the game should address both of those. But the thing about that was it was one of those things where the design of the game was it made a lot of things. So that leak is probably the problem was at the time tracking down that leak was something that it was a hard thing to go do at the time. I think nowadays it'd be easier to do because we have better metrics for those kind of things. But at the time, this was a Windows 95 game. It was a long time ago. So there were fewer mechanisms than there are now to find these kind of bugs. I'd say there's that. So, and we actually had a lot of the game also allocated memory a lot. So as just the way it worked, it allocated a lot of memory. So as a consequence, even though it did use mechanisms to try and forestall, lots of allocation problems that should come up. Obviously, there's still a leak in there someplace, so it was not something we ever came down to finding. So,
were there? I know you guys released a patch after launch. I think it was like 1.02. Were there plans to make like future patches or even additions to the game? I think DLC is kind of like a new kind of concept, but I think back then we still had expansion packs. Were there any considerations for like expansion packs?
I don't think so, actually. I think it was at the time. It wasn't. I'm not sure. Actually, it was really clear the game was viewed as being hugely successful at the time. I mean, I think all the press run ran out. It was actually, I think when it came out initially, it did very well, but I think there was a mix. The reviews were on a mix. Were kind of mixed. There definitely was a case where there were people who were like, is this just reskin Master of Orion? I remember some reviews along those lines. So I think there wasn't necessarily like a lot of internal pressure to make an addition to it, because I think that was the thing. And plus, at the time, I think there were lots of other products coming out. Though the funny thing about it is, I think one of the things that makes Star Trek have legs as opposed to those other games is actually Star Trek actually had viable multiplayer. Turn-based multiplayer, whereas like Master of Orion and Civilization really at that time were all single-player games. So this is one of the first games that you actually have real multiplayer.
Oh yeah, I didn't even realize that. Huh? Wow. What materials was kind of left from the game development, like regarding like art or unreleased alpha versions or things like that? Was there anything left over from game development?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by leftover. I mean, the project sort of wrapped up. I believe there were probably like more races that could have been included. I mean, Star Trek has a huge number. We actually stopped at a certain point because there were only so many races you could include in a game. And I know there was some art for different kinds of icons, for different kinds of things you could add. There were some things that were tuned out, like structures on planets and ships that were tuned out. Because either they were unbalanced or not quite really what we wanted to do. So I remember there were things like that were probably left out. But as far as it goes, most everything else went in, and certainly the construction of the 3D ships was pretty much every one of those that were built were stuck in. It's just because it's just the time and effort to make those 3D ships was actually very specialized. So every one of those we got put in the game. So
nice. Yeah, I always, I'm kind of curious because, like, some of the ships that you have in the game, I don't know if I remember seeing them on Star Trek Next Generation. Did you guys kind of, like, originally design some of those ships?
Some of them were designed by us, yeah. Because you needed a transport ship, or you need a colony ship, you need some of these things that basically were never made before, so we had to make some. Especially for these other races, right? So, like, what's the Ferengi dreadnought? What is, So a lot of these ships just basically had to be made up by us, yeah.
I guess one question that I guess the community had was, what happened to the source code of the game after release?
Well, that's owned by Microprose, or if you will, Spectrum Holobyte, which got acquired by Hasbro. So Hasbro has the rights to the code.
Oh.
Whether or not they know where it is, I don't know. That's a different question. So it was certainly on a server backed up because basically Hasbro acquired Microprose, and so during the sale they got all the assets. So that's where the code for it happens to be.
Huh.
And even though Hasbro, like, I don't know if they sold it to someone else, or because I think they did take those game assets, right, and sold it to Atari, So
well, it's a weird convoluted thing because there's There's Atari, which is really like Infogrames, and then there's Hasbro, and then right now I believe the Microprose brand has been bought by Nordic Games. So Nordic Games is now looking at trying to revive like M1 Tank and Gunship or whatever. I don't know what they're exactly trying to do, but they have a number of the old Microprose brands, and I think they're interested in trying to revive them. I don't actually know the specifics of that, but I think that's what's going on. But I don't. The thing that's tricky about Star Trek is weird because it's got you have to deal with Paramount, right? So there's the licensing that goes with that. If this was a game that was just strictly a Microprose title, then it's something you could do with. It'd be easier to figure out what to do with it. But I'm not sure when you add the extra layer of Star Trek on.
So there were rumors when the game released. I think it came out maybe like a year later or so. But I remember there were rumors that there was talk of like a second Star Trek Birth of the Federation game. Was there any discussion of that, or was just that simply a rumor?
Well, I think there wasn't really a discussion on our end about it. I mean, that was not really something, because Wella and I moved on to a different project, so we did not actually talk about that on our end. And really, I think the thing about it is at the time, like I said, you look at it and go, I'm really happy that people enjoy the game, but at the time it was not necessarily received as a super huge hit, right? It did not pull down the kind of numbers that, say, Civilization pulled down, right? So that's why I don't think people looked at it that way.
How many copies of the game were originally released in the first year?
2 million is the number, I think. At least that's what I was told.
Oh, okay.
And I think all 2 million units got sold. So, and there was never another run after that.
Oh, wow. I always wondered, I guess, why they never made a second game, and I guess maybe that was one of the reasons. Even though it had like such a huge, it still does have a huge fan community behind it.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I'm really glad that people actually have modded it and made it into a game that they wanted to make it into, which is great. I think the thing about it is, it's like at the time there wasn't really. It did well, and I think all the copies got sold, but it was one of those things where. At the time, there was just lots of other games coming out at the same time. And so it sort of, I think, got lost in the shuffle of all the stuff that came out. So it is a unique game because there weren't any games like it. There were not as many games like it coming out at the time. But I think the other thing, too, is, if you really think about that time, there were a lot of, that was at the beginning of when 3D acceleration was happening. So there were lots of games that were, I think, probably visually more stunning than Star Trek. It's not that kind of game, though. It's not what it's trying to do. And, if you just look at that, because that was, the time when first-person shooters were really starting to kick up and really be really accepted. Doom and Quake were around before then, but, the quality of those games was increasing substantially. And if you really want to get down to it, I think the other issue really is the fact that 4X strategy games were not as big as sellers as what you would get out of, say, sitting down at that time and doing a first-person shooter, right? You would make more money as a game company making a first-person shooter than you would necessarily making a 4X strategy game.
What do you guys think about present day? I had one of the product managers from Microprose on. I think it was our first episode, and one of the things I brought up, because they reconstituted Microprose back, and one of the first questions I had was any possibility for Star Trek Birth of the Federation 2, and he was mentioning that there's a possibility, but there's also licensing. How do you feel if they did like a Star Trek Birth of the Federation 2? Would that be received better today, since it's kind of like the second golden age of Star Trek with all the new series?
I think so. I think that would be. I think the thing that would make it is strategy games have really made a comeback, especially because of tablets and mobile now. I think you got to think about the time, right? At the time, in 1999 or so, or 2000, people just are forking out fairly large amounts of money to get their fancy 3D graphics card, and they want to use it for something cool. And also, I think the thing is strategy games were popular then, but not. They kind of had a wane after that, right? But now I think if you really look at what mobile has done, and strategy games have really made a comeback in the mobile areas and on tablets and other places, and I think it would do better now because of the fact that there's a larger market, especially because you could easily see how this game would be very strong as a mobile title on a tablet, right?
Yeah, that would be a dream come true for me if this came on the.
That would be the logical thing to do now. Like you could make this game easily. I wouldn't say easily. I take that back. You could make this game and see it do well because mobile is such a large market. Because you got to remember, this is at a time when distribution. There was only 2 million units pressed, and so that limits what you can do because you have to pay the cost to press it and get it into a store and have it show up at Walmart. That's not an issue as much now because of mobile, right? You just have to get into it just has to get in the Apple store and it has to get in the Android store. And after that, distribution is less of a problem than it was these days. Because you got to remember during those days, if there were deals that were set up so that, okay, if the game doesn't sell, then the publisher might have to buy the copies back from, say, Walmart or something like that. So you're risking stuff because it's a cost of goods thing then. Whereas... So doing a 2 million press, of the PC game could be a disaster if your game doesn't work out well and you're stuck with, the equivalent of ET or something like that. So there's a risk to making those. So now that really has gone away, and that's why you have way more games now being built, and so much so that it's just a case of curating what it is to get out of the store, because so many people make so many things, right? So I think that's a big difference from then to now, right?
One question I have for both of you would be every game kind of leaves its mark on its development team. So I'm kind of curious, what kind of great memories do you guys have from making this game?
I'll let Wella start.
Well, actually, mine is more that my memories. Really, a lot of them have to do with just the many long hours that we had to put into this game. Like, they were long days, long nights. There was a lot of work we put into the game. And so it's actually really nice to know now that Birth of the Federation has these legs that even though it's, what is it now, 22 years later, that people are still playing it and talking about it. And Jean, when you actually reached out and emailed me and said, "Hey, are you the one who worked on Birth of the Federation? Because I have this podcast, I want to talk to you." And I did some Googling because I had a faint idea that there was still a community out there playing the game. And Bill had mentioned it to me. Like, we had seen each other a couple of times, over the years. Mentioned to me that, someone reached out to me and, just said that they were asking questions about Birth of the Federation. And, and someone reached out to me on Facebook several years ago saying, "Hey, do you know where the source code is?" And these were just haha, isn't that amusing? But it wasn't until you reached out, John, that I actually went and looked, and I was like, holy cow, I didn't realize this was how hardcore this community was. I didn't know. And I think that's amazing. It's just nice to know that something we put so much work in for, almost 2 years, paid off in that way, paid off in a way that it has, its own kind of this legacy where it still lives. I mean, how many projects have we all worked on that, you do it, it's done, it goes out, it's over, you move on to the next thing. And it's really nice to know that this has taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, I would agree. I've worked on a lot of games, actually, since then. I've worked on, 20 or 30 games over my career now, and this is the only game that actually has a following like this that I've worked on. And it's kind of funny because it's the second game I really ever worked on professionally. And I've worked on a lot of games. I've worked on games that do have followings as well, but not in the same sense. And I guess I never had a hand in those games that was quite like this. Since I wrote the first line of code in this game, and I worked on a lot of parts of this game, even though the credit really goes to all the individual people who worked on this game. And there was a lot of design input from engineering, because in those days we had a designer, but it's a very different time then to now, where engineering played a really pivotal role in how the game turned out in terms of the design, which is less so nowadays, with large scale projects and games that we work on now that are just like huge numbers of people working on these titles. So I think the biggest thing about this game is there's a little bit of everyone who worked on it in the game. Sammy can take credit for a lot of the way space combat works. Steve can take credit for how the diplomacy works, and the fact that we have treaties that were, actually people that the game actually respects it. That's something that you didn't see before. I think Dave did all the map generation, which is fairly complicated. John worked on economy, and Alice worked on the intelligence system where you could steal ships and money. This was not something that actually you'd seen before in games. So there was a lot of, and at least the 4X games, there were a lot of interesting new things that people came up with that I think, did move the 4X genre forward, that were in this game. But I think it has that same kind of problem that I think you see with licensed properties, which is a lot of people discount the license and assume that you're just slapping the license on just to make a quick buck. And so they sort of discount the cool things that are in the game that were new. And so I think that was one of the things that sort of afflicted it. It's like, oh, you guys are just trying to make a quick buck, and you put the Star Trek title on this game that's just a generic strategy game, which I don't think it was, and I'm glad that people don't feel that way. But I think there was a feeling, that was a criticism of the game. But I'd argue that people who had that criticism never really played it very much to find out. So I think that's to me the coolest thing, was the fact that people made these little contributions here and there that really made this game stand out. But it's hard for people to know about it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I completely agree with you that people that commented like that really haven't played the game at least thoroughly, because I've played Master of Orion, I've played pretty much every other game, and I don't feel like there's any other game like Star Trek Brotherhood of Federation, which is the reason why I keep coming back to it. I mean, there are mods for other games like Stellaris that they put Star Trek in, which in essence they literally just slapped Star Trek on the title, but I don't feel like it had the soul of Star Trek like it does in this game, because every time I play it, I feel like I'm commanding the Federation, and the voiceovers, and I still will go into the game and just play Federation and watch that mini clip that starts before the game begins, which I always love, and it still holds really great memories for me.
Yeah, so that actually comes, like I said, for that, some of that heritage comes from really playing Dune, the board game, which basically comes from the idea that each of the different races is, and that also came about from QA too. We had tuned the game to be how because each race has different specific advantages, actually rewarded for playing like that race, right? So the Federation, you could play a super warlike Federation if you wanted to, but it really goes against the way the advantages of the Federation, right? And similarly, you could play a super warlike Ferengi, but it's hard to do that. Whereas, if you play the Cardassians and use their intelligence to all the maximum that you can, then you'll notice that they do super well, and the game plays to the strengths. In some sense, it lets you role play those actual races and leverages the advantages, because you see that in both diplomacy, economics, and the tech in a way that's much more integrated. Whereas if you look at other games like Master of Orion, and Master of Orion, like the Cylons are tech heavy, but there isn't that combined package of an advantage to make friends, for example, which the Federation has. And there isn't an advantage economically to do some of the things that you do. So they're really, and you can even see how the minor races treat the different 5 big races. So that it really tried to differentiate the races on a lot of different levels besides just the simple, okay, you get +1 on attack, which is what a lot of games do. And that extended all the way from the UI to the voiceover and the writing that way, but also the ship design. So that was a big entertainment. There's just trying to make each of the races very distinct and have very distinct advantages. I remember, I think there was a guy named Ryan in QA who played the Ferengi who kept on complaining that he was getting robbed blind by the Cardassians. And that's exactly what happened. But he still could win because he just by having lots of money, even though he gets robbed, it's the cost of doing business. And the Cardassian player, I can't remember his name, but did a great job of just stealing ships and whatnot. And that's exactly what that's what the game was meant to do.
Wow. I guess the last few questions that I have, one of the second to last question I have is one of the genius pieces of the game, I feel, is, as you get closer to that end game, I feel, and, the powers are fighting and such, is the Borg. Now, I got to ask you guys, where did that come from? Because I thought that was a stroke of genius where, all the powers are kind of like settled and they got fleets, and all of a sudden you have the Borg come out of nowhere and they kind of change the dynamics of the game.
Well, that was actually... So the thing about it is that actually goes with the random event. That was the Borg were really meant as a lot of games have random events. Master of Orion has a random event too, but it seemed very fitting with Star Trek because there are a number of random events that just happen, and the Borg is the most notable. But it's the one that you really the one thing it does for the game, and actually it's one of the reasons we had to release a patch because it was overpowered. Because the Borg got out of control and could ruin a game pretty quickly. The thing about it is what it does is it introduces something to the game where all the players have to deal with it immediately, right? So it's a game changer for everyone, regardless of where you are in the game, because you have to deal with it now. And that's exactly what you wanted. It's the kind of thing it was intended to be the kind of thing that we could make a big enough change to really reset the game in terms of your position. So that's one of the things that we were shooting from a design point of view, that if you look at it, mini games basically, once you get so far ahead, you can't ever come back, right? And especially you can see that in a lot of strategy games, right? And the Borg have the effect of being a table reset because if you don't deal with it, then it becomes a problem. And if other people don't deal with it, it becomes a problem. And it's even something to the effect that in a multiplayer game, people suddenly have to make alliances to deal with this, because if they don't, they all go down.
Yeah, I always thought that was a stroke of genius. Special thank you for that.
That was what was intended. That was what was intended, and it seemed to be pretty fitting with what the license had to do, right? So that was pretty much what it was intended to do.
And I guess my last question is, what are you guys up to today? I know you guys made the game in '98, released in '99, but what are you guys up to today?
I'll let Wella answer first.
Yeah, well, I'm not in the game industry. That pretty much Birth of the Federation was the last game that I worked on. And after that, I went into television production, mainly for, like factual TV. So I work on shows for a lot of like cable networks. I'm working on a court TV show right now. I've worked on stuff for like Animal Planet, National Geographic Channel, Discovery Channel, that kind of thing. So, yeah, so I'm not in games. It's really nice to hear Bill talk about games because he's so passionate about it, and reminded me of like why it was so much fun working with him and with the rest of the folks at Spectrum Holobyte and Microprose. It's like really good people, It's really nice working at a game company where everyone is dedicated, and we're all just like looking forward to finishing the project. I have that a lot working in TV production, but the game industry is a really fun place. I'm glad that I worked there, even though I was there for a short time.
Yeah, I stayed in games. Actually, after Microprose, I went to Electronic Arts. I
Oh,
worked on a lot of titles for Electronic Arts. I worked on NASCAR and Knockout Kings and Lord of the Rings. I worked on let's see, Godfather. I worked on a number of EA titles. And then after that, I went to work for Activision. I worked on Call of Duty. I worked on Guitar Hero. I worked on X-Men. I worked on Spider-Man. Um, so for them, and I've worked on a lot of different kinds of titles. And then right now, I have a company that basically now does something similar. We basically help out large companies, and we've worked on a number of projects for a number of companies. I've worked on Batman titles. I've worked on, let's see, it's a long list of different things from Call of Duty to World of Tanks.
wow.
I've worked on a lot of different kinds of things, and we basically just fix things for people. That's pretty much I'd say. As an engineering group, the company I work for basically just fixes various problems for other people, and whether it's make games, port games, we've worked on zombie games, we've worked on quite a few zombie games actually. We've worked on Dead Rising, we've worked on yeah. So I'd say I've worked on a lot of different franchises. I've seen the inside of a lot of different games. Though the funny thing is, I have not come back to very many strategy games. So I've worked on a lot of different things over time.
You literally did everything, gaming wise.
Well, like I say, I would say I've worked on a lot of things and helped them with little projects here and there. So my company has at least, and we've done a lot of little things here and there, and a lot of whether it be fixing bugs, making patches, that kind of stuff. I think the last game I shipped for Activision as an Activision employee was Guitar Hero Van Halen.
So, oh, nice.
So basically, there's a wide gamut of projects. I think I worked on Enemy Territory, Quake Wars. There's just been a lot of projects I've worked on, and I've stayed in the game industry, and I've seen how the game industry has really changed from the time that I worked on Birth of Federation to now. And it's changed a lot. The game industry has changed substantially from then to now. And I've worked on the teams where I was in. I've been in. I was in Cube 255 of as a developer number 255 on a project, and where we were shipping. I think that was on Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. I was the 255 person to be added, and I worked on the multiplayer of that game. So as an example, but I just worked on just that tiny part.
And I guess I gotta add one more question before we finish. If Microprose came forward and said, "Hey guys, we want to make a Birth of the Federation 2," would you guys come on and start the project all over again and make a sequel?
It all boils down to whether or not there's money in it to do it. But yeah.
Actually, this is my question for Bill, and even for you, Jean. If there was a Birth of the Federation 2, let's just say there is the money. Some financier is going to back this. Some GoFundMe is going to come up with all the money. But you're to make a Birth of the Federation 2, but without a Star Trek license. Is it doable? Is it the same game?
I don't think it is. That's the problem. I think it's just not the same game without the Star Trek. Because part of it is, I think that one of the things about Birth of Federation is it really did absorb Star Trek into it. I mean, you really see it in terms of the minor races, the way it's used. I think it'd be hard to make a Star Trek game without the actual Star Trek license. If you really want to make a sequel to this game, it would be, because there's plenty of people. I think Jean said there's plenty of 4X, galaxy type space games out there. But I think it loses something without the Star Trek license. I think you'd have a hard time making the same game without that, because people identify with the Star Trek aspect of the game, and people, I think, who are fans of Star Trek see it in the game. That's the thing I think but you kind of have to, and why it turned out the way it did. Because I think the people who built the game were fans of the game, and I think you see that in the game as well.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, it would. I think you guys, when you made the game, you captured the essence, the soul of Star Trek. And, as a huge Star Trek fan, I felt that with everything that you guys did in this game, from like even just all the little things like the UI, the voiceovers, basically everything. It did such an incredible job that, that's why I don't even like bother I trying games that have like a modded Star Trek, because it would have Federation here and Klingons here, but it would not have the essence, the flavor of Star Trek.
Yeah, because part of it is, I think the thing about this game was it was designed with Star Trek around it. I mean, really, it was pretty much designed with the idea that it was going to be set in a Star Trek world and what you were going to take advantage of, and it really went down the path of, okay, you're going to be the Klingons or the Federation, and this is what it's going to be like for you to do that. And it took it from that approach. I think that's the thing that's just reskinning the UI and changing some numbers to rebalance a game is not going to be enough to make that work, because you can kind of see it in terms of like the way the game incentivizes you to do things as well. All the way down from treaties to the tech tree to everything else. It's actually very much ingrained in the game how to be a Klingon, a Cardassian, a Ferengi, or Romulan, or a Federation player. It is, and it's more than just simply, a game balance thing, right? There's actually more of a, I would almost say, role-playing aspect to it.
Yes, I think that's the perfect, I think that nails it down perfectly.
So, I mean, and so that's one of the things that I think it sets it apart from other strategy games. That's what I think, at least. But yeah, I would certainly be more than happy to work on it again. It was one of these games that I was actually, like I said, it's left a mark on me as a game that I really, really appreciate the fact that everyone likes this game so much and has this much staying power and legs. Because it's very rare that I've worked on plenty of games where people play it for 4 or 8 hours, they're done, and they never look at it again. And they don't even remember what they did in the game. They don't remember when they played it, right? I've worked on those kind of games, right? Even though the game, sold lots of units and so forth, but this game, at least, Birth Federation, has staying power with people and want to keep playing it. And actually, I think it's a testament to emergent gameplay, which is something that most games don't do these days, right? The only games like 4X games and strategy games that have, because really a lot of games now, not all of them, to be fair, because there's plenty of games that actually have procedurally generated worlds and so forth, but a lot of games are very heavily scripted affairs, right? And once you've played those routes, you're done, right? You've played, you've played all aspects of the game that you're going to play, and then there's really no reason to play it again. Whereas Star Trek, it captures every game is going to be different, because they are. And then on top of that, your experience is, the thing that you're trying to capture in all turn-based games and strategy games are like, okay, I just want to see one more turn. I want to see what's going to happen based on what I just did. That's the thing that's special about this genre of games that's emergent gameplay, which is, like I said, if you can take a look at all the action shooters and so forth that have a scripted storyline, and once you play that out, you're done. So this game has a staying power because it has something that basically over time is engaging and is different every time.
Yeah, I always find that. Yeah, totally. Well, I guess that does it for. If there, before we finish up, is there anything that I missed that you guys want to cover or anything like that?
I'm good. Unless Wella has anything else to add.
No, I'm good. Although I have this vision of, Bill, of your company buying a Star Trek license, and you're going to make off too.
Or almost everyone in engineering is right now that works on that project. Almost everybody. But
we're going to get the band back together.
Well, if you guys do decide to do that and do it like a GoFundMe or Kickstarter, I guarantee you the top tier that you guys have, that'll be where I put my money in. Thanks, guys, for coming on, and we'll catch you guys next time.